morning everybody. Thank you for joining. I plan to talk for about 30 minutes and then 30 to 40 minutes, and then I'm happy to take questions at the end, as David said, through the panel. So start off with a tiny bit about me. My name is Rich Knight. I'm a continuous improvement advisor in the Environment Agency. So I work in a central team. My background is in continuous improvement, kind of Lean Six Sigma and innovation and improvement type areas, change management. Previous to the Environment Agency, I worked in the police for 10 years, so I have a bit of a background in this. So what I plan to do is take you through a few slides that talk a little bit about the Environment Agency, so give you a bit of background about what we do and kind of what we're here to and our vision, etc. And then I'm going to talk a bit about, as the slide title says, introducing systems thinking in the Environment Agency. So very much around the way we manage performance, so performance management. Not in terms of a sort of HR definition, so I'm not talking about capability and discipline, but the way we manage organisational performance. So as I say, if there's any questions, pop them through on the panel and I'll do my best to answer them at the end. Okay, so this first slide is just aimed to give a little bit around the Environment Agency. Who are we and what do we do? We are an arm's length body. I think that's the definition, and we're here to protect and improve the environment in England. We used to look after Wales as well. In the last several years ago, there was an organisational change, and then Natural Resources Wales was set up. So that's a sort of a fusing, if you like, of the Countryside Council for Wales, Forestry Commission, and the Environment Agency. So we're just looking after the environment exclusively in England. We're part of the DEFRA family, so the Department of Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. And our role, really, if you wanted to sort of boil it down, we have quite a broad remit. We sort of regulate industry. That's a big role that we do. So nuclear power stations, waste science, stuff like that. We look at improving the environment through partnership programs and kind of biodiversity, habitat restoration, that kind of stuff. And then one of the sort of primary roles that we have is to protect people from flooding. So we have responsibility for flood defence. And we also have oversight on coastal flood defences as well, so working with local authorities in England for that. Couple of figures, ballpark figures, we've got around 10,000 staff and we've got a £1 billion budget, so that gives you a rough idea of where we sit in the sort of scheme of things. And as I say, yeah, remit's pretty wide. Everything from issuing fishing licences to regulating nuclear power stations. So we have a real mix of and a diverse workforce of people. Okay, so a little bit about our vision, what we're here to do. We have lots of different pots of money or funding streams to fund our work, from kind of grant and aid that we get from central government through to charges that we have from customers. So customers, we charge them to permit their site, for example. So it's kind of a functional approach. The various streams of money and the pots of money can only be spent on certain areas. This works really well for business planning, for planning our money and our activities and our outcomes. It allows us to map the income to the activities, so we can start to look at where we're spending money. However, this is the however bit, some of the central services could be better managed as a system. So we're talking about transactional things like customer service, call centres, permitting, where we issue permits for things like the fishing licences I mentioned earlier. Anything that's kind of multifunctional that works across teams. We do a lot of work with planning consents as well. So whilst we need to be able to exist and manage in a functional way, all the different sort of expert teams we have, a lot of our services require multiple teams working together in a system to deliver for the customer. So the purpose of this work is to try and introduce that thinking and that way of management, so kind of managing across teams rather than just within teams. That's the sort of area we're looking at there. Okay, so moving on to culture. We're reasonably progressive as an organisation, I think it's fair to say. We've had continuous improvement and sort of change management in the organisation as an official discipline for over 10 years, but we do have cultural pockets, as most large organisations do. From a senior management level, I think it's fair to say we do take culture very seriously. We have lots of proactive events and communications from our senior managers, our directors and our leaders. And our staff survey results are, on the whole, really encouraging. Our staff do say that they feel like senior leaders really do listen to what they have to say, which is really important. But sometimes we do make things difficult for ourselves, perhaps unintentionally. So as an example, if you look at the 4th bullet point down, the one that says focus on outcomes, not processes, this is part of our sort of cultural statement. Our intention here was to make sure that we stayed focused on the environment, because that's our reason for being, for existing. However, an unintended side effect is that the word process has become a little bit, if I'm honest, a bit of a dirty word in some parts of our organisation, and our team are trying to reclaim that. So the intention really is to focus on why we're here. However, we all know that outcomes don't deliver themselves, and you need systems and processes which people work in to deliver those. So I think for us, we've had a bit of a challenge trying to almost reclaim that statement. We can't ignore processes if they're complex and overly complex and full of waste and extra steps, and it's making it difficult for people to deliver their outcome. Then we need to focus on them to make them simpler rather than ignore them. So as I said, I don't think that was the intention, but that's one example of where we perhaps wasn't able to think exactly through how things would be perceived. So moving on to the sort of KPI world, which I know a lot of local authorities have had that in place for some time. A little bit of history about where we've come from. So I think I mentioned earlier we have a central CI team of 10 people, and we have an active network, I think it's fair to say, of over 300 staff trained in improvement of some kind. Some of that's been internal training, which we've delivered in-house. Some of it has been professional external training. And over the last 5 years, we have seen a slow shift of culture kind of away from the sort of traditional command and control approach of sort of KPIs. I'm sure most of you will be able to relate to that, particularly in sort of local authorities, if you've been in long enough to remember the sort of best value performance indicators, and very often the sort of suite of KPIs, which in a sense we end up with so many of them, certainly in the Environment Agency, that you could almost cross off the keyword. We just have lots of performance indicators, and a lot of the time the real decision making that needs to be made is lost in the noise. We have sort of traditional red, amber, green traffic light systems, which work well with certain measures, if you like, progressing milestones and project delivery, etc. But sometimes they're not a very robust way statistically to look at things like trends. So that's sort of where we've come from, a slow shift away from that. What we're trying to focus on, particularly on the cultural side, is moving to a culture where our leaders are creating teams where staff aren't afraid to make mistakes, trying to reduce this culture of fear, so that we can encourage people to admit a mistake and then learn from it. I guess you could call it moving from a kind of managing your reputation to managing performance. So having open and honest conversations, because those times where our staff feel comfortable, there's a lot of studies out there across all sectors in the world, where our staff do feel comfortable to admit those mistakes. That's where a lot of the learning comes from. And also trying to sort of break down that, as I mentioned, that silo mentality, working within functions. We certainly need it. We manage our people and our money kind of down the organisation, but as I said, in things like systems and some of the transactional things we do, we need to be looking across the departmental boundaries, really. So yeah, this change which we're trying to sort of enable is a combination really of training programs with new team leaders, and then our talent programs, what we call the developing the sort of future leaders for us. So there's some cultural stuff there. There's some awareness training and that kind of thing. And then obviously we have a program of improvement projects, as close as we can get them tied to sort of corporate risk, the areas we need to work on, that have been really successful, and people have seen those being successful. So for example, improving response times for customer service. That's quite a nice, easy, simple one that most people can relate to. I mentioned permits earlier. We're running a pilot on how we deliver our permits, changing the way we're working, and providing planning guidance and advice as well. So we're trying to get more of these case studies into the business so people can see the benefits of sort of managing in this way. So just a quick word on kind of, we've got more to do. There's certainly lots more to do for this. we wanted to transform the way our organisation managed performance. That's our goal, and that keyword there's transformation, with all the cultural change that comes with it. Kind of coincidentally and luckily for us, around the same time, the ISO standards were significantly revised for this year. So the kind of qualification we need to maintain that accreditation, so 9001 particularly, were revised to ensure that they are leading continuous improvement and making sure that we're not just kind of doing the tick box exercise for an audit, that's actually driving our improvement activity, which is fantastic. And then at a similar time, I'm sure most of you have seen that the National Audit Office, a report was published, I think this was in the last 6 months or so. It was a 6-year study across all the public sector, basically with some key recommendations which completely support continuous improvement and systems thinking. So they were around have visibility and management by system, focus on your customer, focus on helping and enable people that work in the system to come up with the solution. So these were fantastic. If I'm honest, quite a kind of extrinsic motivator and an external one. But what it did do was create an imperative for our organisation and a critical mass to say that, you know, these two things we need to be listening to and we need to be driving it. So that sort of created an imperative for change, really. So how did we go about it? Awareness for our executive directors and senior leaders. That's a sort of standard approach to transformational change and particularly cultural change. So we aiming to get buy-in at the top, and certainly more of our senior directors as well. But also, as I mentioned earlier, very much looking at the new team leaders as well that are coming through on training programs, so that we're approaching this from a kind of grassroots level and from a strategic level. One of the issues which we found, particularly in the early days when people were on continuous improvement courses, was they were really motivated to do the work, but they didn't have the capacity to do it outside of their day job. I hear that quite a lot as a constant challenge across the public sector particularly. And by sort of having awareness training for sort of new team leaders, for example, that allows them to recognise the importance of stepping off the treadmill once in a while and being able to look at how you're working and how to improve. So what we were finding with the early days of our team leader training was that it was starting to transform some of the managers' attitudes. So they were able to create capacity for these people that have been on the course to actually go and practice and then make improvements. So that was a sort of self-sustaining thing at the grassroots level as well as the senior leaders. So having that kind of line of sight, if you like, we all talk about that quite often, or the sort of golden thread, it allows us to work completely aligned with the government direction and the strategy as well. So I mentioned earlier, we're part of DEFRA. We have a strategic plan for DEFRA in terms of working better, closer together, and our systems way of working completely supports that. And as I mentioned earlier as well, recommendations from the audit office. So in terms of sort of strategic direction, it is aligned, which I think is great. We've certainly struggled in the past with that. The other thing culturally was kind of reassurance to staff that this was not a stealth change program. And when I use the term change program, a organisational official change program, this was not about structural change. It wasn't about shifting people around and reducing jobs. It was around changing the way we manage our work and the way we approach our work. So something that is compatible within existing structures. So there were no sort of issues or anything around that. And I think, yeah, it's fair to say, as the sort of strapline for all of this work is, it's about how we work together across our teams to deliver the outcomes. We were trying to keep the sort of messaging as simple as possible. Okay, so this slide is just illustrating some of the sort of wide remit and the things we do. When we started this, using senior leaders and kind of staff from all levels, throughout some sort of series of workshops, are very much a traditional approach to improvement. We started looking at prioritization. So where do we start? If we want to manage by systems, where's a good place to start? So following a series of workshops and using some of the continuous improvement tools, we sort of mapped out our organisation using a system map, so a very simple tool to sort of map out what your department does or your business does on kind of one piece of paper. and we've decided with all the workshops on 6 core Gemba systems, so our sort of core bread and butter, if you like. And they were compliance, so that's checking that sites that we regulate are compliant with the terms of their license, that they're not emitting too much air pollution, or they're not taking too much water out of the ground, for example. That's a specific system requiring lots of teams to do that. Enforcement activity, so that's where we take legal action if permits, for example, aren't if they're continually breached. That's one of the options we have, is to prosecute. There's permitting, which is obviously the sort of front end, that's getting the permit out to our customers in the first place. Lots of monitoring, that's one of the other systems, so not just monitoring sites and kind of organisations' behaviour. This is looking at things like rivers, flow gauges, telemetry, and all of the environmental science that sort of goes with that. The final 2 are incidents. So I mentioned earlier, we do have a major incident role where we have big flooding events or a huge pollution event. Hopefully they don't happen too often, but we get involved with multi sort of partner approach with that. And then the final one, which is very important to lots of people, is obviously flood defences themselves. We have a responsibility to build and maintain them for those what we call our assets, those flood defences which we own, and then also we have oversight of those which are owned by a third party. So those are our 6 systems which we agreed on. We then proposed a pilot, so very much doing the kind of DMAIC plan, do, study, act approach. We wanted to pilot this system to see if it would work. So we chose permitting for a number of reasons, really. We had quite strong leadership in that area. There was a lot of work we'd done previously for people at all levels understanding kind of continuous improvement and systems thinking. It's also a very transactional part of the business, which we know most of you know who've been involved, I'm sure, with continuous improvement. When you're demonstrating the kind of benefits of it, it works really well on a transactional system. So putting a permit out to a customer is very clear for that. We could draw a clear box around it, and we could say this is what we're going to look at. A couple of other points on that in terms of a pilot. We got a local champion, so we had one of our operations managers, an area manager. So we have 16 areas in the Environment Agency, and we picked somebody who had experience of working in systems, so they had a private sector background. They understood this stuff at a strategic level, but also at an operational level. But also they've been in our organisation long enough to have credibility within our business as well. So they understood the kind of front end, if you like, the sort of shop floor side of the business as well. So it was, as with a lot of change projects, culturally having a strong sponsor who can influence your key stakeholders is absolutely crucial. That was certainly something we learned from talking to other organisations as well. And as I say, not just the credibility, but also the reliability with our senior leaders who are making the decisions. So what did we do? We mapped out the permitting system using the workshop approach. We went through this model. This is a very simple slide of a system map. Obviously, there's detail set behind this. But effectively, we went about using people from all different teams at all levels of seniority, and we literally filled in the boxes. So if you look at the sort of bottom of the page, there's 5 sort of rectangles. We started there. That's our sort of core work. So we started saying, okay, who are our customers for permitting? And we did a customer segmentation exercise and put them into 5 broad groups. Who are they and what are their requirements? And we ran through a few tools to work out requirements. Then we moved across to the left and looked at outputs. A happy customer, hopefully, is when they've received what they're after. So we looked at the outputs. What are those outputs? They weren't just permits. They were advice. They were reasons why a permit was refused, for example, which is a legitimate service we provide as well. They're not always welcomed by the customer. So we sort of mapped those out as well. Moving on to the left still, the blue box, that's the sort of core processes. What are the main processes that we use to deliver those outputs? Again, moving further to the left on the input side, but processes can't run themselves. They need people, materials, money to actually run. So we looked at those, and obviously those inputs, again in turn going over to the left, finally are supplied by suppliers. Some of them internal, some of them external. So that sort of ranged from legislation and direction from government right down to bums on seats, FTEs, money, pots of money, people, etc. So once we sort of looked at that, we had a good broad understanding of our main steps. We looked at the supporting services, so that's the sort of people at the bottom. What are the IT and infrastructure that needs to be in place to deliver that? Then we looked at measures, so do we have suitable measures in place for all of those boxes? And the answer was that we didn't. We were managing stuff by teams pretty well, but some of the issues in terms of timeliness and quality were resting, as a lot of these things do, across teams. They were the boundaries between teams. So that was an early lesson we picked up. And then just very quickly moving up to the top of the page, so this is where we put in for our pilot, we put in a structure to have somebody owning this system overall. So we had one of our directors had kind of volunteered for the duty of system owner. We didn't have a structure where each of these 6 systems were owned with somebody who had the authority to make changes across the teams. It's very much all organised and managed by teams. So that was a big sort of cultural change which we were using in the pilot. And obviously, if we have the measures in place, they can be used by the owners to make adjustments and changes and really look at where we need to make some changes. So as I mentioned, we developed the measures using knowledge of the people that are actually in the business. We found gaps where we needed to start measuring things, particularly between teams, but we also found places where we could stop measuring things, which again, overall, I would think it's fair to say that we'll be reducing the burden of how much it kind of costs to measure this stuff. We've managed to boil it down to sort of 6 high-level, what we call alert measures, which the idea being that they tell us when indicating when there's a problem to kind of dive in. Obviously, from the nature of what we're doing, we had an end-to-end view of the entire system and the customer journey. So the customer would experience all of the teams involved, so we needed to start measuring and managing that way. Getting in a position where we can start challenging meaningless targets, which was quite interesting. So one of the government targets we had for a particular type of permits only measured sort of half of the process. So we're now able to measure that, work out where we can help customers, for example, fill in their electronic forms better, give them better guidance, so that we reduce the defects that are coming in up front, and therefore the sort of waste and rework. So rather than just sort of effectively put our head in the sand and say we can't influence that, actually we can, and we can work with our key customers and work out where the common mistakes are. And if it is the design of our forms, for example, online or paper-based, some of our customers still prefer, we can start to work with them to try and improve that so that they get it right first time. So it helps us, and it certainly helps them. And I think, yeah, we had several comments from people working in several of these teams that these new measures. We had a few comments around that they're, for the first time they feel they're accurately measuring and representing what they do in their day job, which was a really important point for us to get that buy-in, really, because they were involved in designing some of the measures. So I think that was a key learning point for us, certainly. So then it's a sort of then what? Where did we go from there? One of the key challenges that we have had is we were trying to break this kind of mindset that was in pockets of our organisation, that the measurement alone delivers improvement. So this kind of idea that just having measures and targets in place is enough to deliver sustained improvement, which of course we all know it's not. The slide there is to represent a very complex machine, which all of our organisations are. And understanding if you change one cog, you have to understand what's driving it and what it's driving as well. So understanding the impact. You may fix something in one part of the business that may create another problem, sort of elsewhere, really. So how did we get across that? As I mentioned, we recruited a system owner. So this was a senior responsible officer that's in change management language for those of you that are familiar with that. With a complete authority to trial and make changes to the entire system across the teams. So that's really important. As I mentioned, we had lots of managers doing the best possible job they could to improve parts of their team. What we were missing was the impact of that overall on the system. So for example, if one team increases the timeliness and they can get kind of permits out quicker, we need to make sure that we have teams on the ground that can then go out and inspect these permits, because otherwise it creates a sort of knock-on effect. So I think that very well documented in continuous improvement circles of that kind of need to look at things across as the whole, really. And then a couple of examples. Yeah, we had already identified kind of additional steps in the process that were not adding value. So kind of excessive sign-offs for particular types of permits, for example, that were clogging up senior management time, and also they were probably sitting around in inboxes, if I'm honest, for longer than they should. We're able to start looking at things like what's the rejection rate of this approval stage. If the rejection rate is really low and we are prepared to take that as a risk as an organisation, for example, we could trial taking that stage out, and then it should make things a lot quicker with sort of minimal risk and improvement to the customer, really. So they're the kind of things that very much we were looking at across the piece. So kind of what's next? What's the next step for us? That's where we are at the moment. I think there will be an increasing drive, particularly from central government, for productivity measures. And I know that's a kind of subject in itself, but kind of a bit more beyond the simple unit costing type things, looking at efficiency, which, we are hopefully in a good position with this pilot to be able to show, where we have efficiency. So, doing meaningful and statistically robust benchmarking across some of our virtual centres, and then looking at kind of best practice and where we can share some good ideas there. Obviously, with also the very much aware of the sort of standardisation debate, if you like. So, making sure that teams have flexibility locally enough to meet customer demands, but that where there are some kind of some standard ways of working that will benefit everybody, that people have a chance to actually learn and follow that. So very much our quality management system, we've got a team here, an environment agency who support that, and there's some great work going on at the moment with that underneath the sort of ISO banner, if you like, making sure that we have got the best system set up, not just to make sure people know how to do their jobs and what the standard is, what the minimum standard is, but also what is the process for them if they recognise that they can make an improvement. We want to make it as easy and as simple as possible for them to feed that in for kind of best practice, really, because our best minds for improvement are the people doing the work, as we all know. So that's the sort of side around efficiency. And then there's financial transparency. Obviously, as a kind of principle across the public sector, of course, that's very important. Particularly for us, it's around making sure we've got clarity on which pot of money has been spent to deliver what environmental outcome. As I mentioned earlier, we are a very broad organisation, and we do a lot of stuff from, as I say, fishing licences to nuclear power stations. So we need to be very clear and confident that we're spending the money on the areas that are getting the most benefit. So that's our sort of next step, really. And then there's obviously a sort of standard, if you like, an evaluation of the project and the benefits realisation. So has this pilot that we're doing of permitting and working in this systems way, how much has it cost completely end to end, and then what's the sort of benefit? So what have we saved in cash releasing terms? What have we saved in productivity terms? And kind of what's the overall cost benefit analysis for that? The idea being that when we've done this open and honest account of our sort of pilot, we'll be able to use that as a case study, hopefully for further areas. One of the things which I'm very keen to demonstrate at this stage is that this system, or this way of working, systems thinking, if you like, is very scalable, a bit like the sort of agile project management approach. This can work at an operational level, but it can also work at a strategic level. So one of the pilots I'd like to do next is a higher level, potentially looking at performance across all other organisations in government. So if you take DEFRA, which is the sort of umbrella body which we're part of, I'd like to look at rolling out this approach as a pilot in another area where we have the Environment Agency and, say, Forestry Commission or Natural England. How do we jointly work together as separate organisations to deliver for the environment? So very much the kind of proving, hopefully, that this works at two levels. And obviously we have 5 other systems, which I mentioned earlier, which we want to try and roll out this approach to as well. But hopefully with a standard approach and with audience that have kind of bought in to how we've done this, and they can see the benefits. We're hoping it will be a sort of easier journey, and we can learn some of the lessons, as I said in the title of what we've done so far. So that's a sort of quick canter through. Hopefully that's been useful for everybody. I've tried to keep it as open and honest as possible. I'm more than happy to use the remaining time to answer any questions that anybody might have. Thank you.
Thank you, Rich. Just before we go into questions, to ask a question, you should have a small grey box upon your screen. If you, as I mentioned at the start, if you go to that and then push the drop-down menu for questions, and then just type your questions in there for Rich. The session will run up to 11 o'clock, so we've got quite a fair bit of time to ask some questions. Just quickly before we get into that, I want to go over the Change Managers Network, which this group is, this webinar series is a part of. We exist mostly as a knowledge hub group, so if you want to join, membership is restricted to public sector only, but from joining the group you'll be able to access all the webinar recordings. There'll also be forums and libraries where we share documents and provide peer support for other public sector staff involved within change management. Finally, this is actually the first webinar that we're doing today. We have another one at 3 o'clock this afternoon. So if you want, this one's around use of social media within public services. So if you want to join that, then you can join the network and then follow the registration link through there. So we have a few questions coming in now, so I'll just read these out for Rich to answer. So the first one is, do you offer any graduate programs?
Okay, yeah, that's a good question. In fact, I was having a conversation with a colleague earlier this week around that. The short answer is no, we don't at the moment. Certainly not in the areas of sort of change management. So we are looking to try and increase and have modules in those programs. So we have a graduate foundation program for things like flood defence and environmental disciplines. What we're trying to do is build in a kind of improvement and change module for that. As I mentioned earlier, we're gradually getting onto some of the other courses. So senior leaders and kind of talent programs, whatever you want to call them. We've now got a seat at the table there to deliver a module, and also with new team leaders as well. So we do quite a few internal programs. I think like most of us, we have very much a squeeze on money. So a lot of our training now, we're fortunate in a position that we can deliver an awful lot of it internally. So yeah, I guess the short answer is we have foundation and graduate programs in environmental stuff, but in terms of improvement, that's an area we want to try and grow.
Thanks, Rich. What I should also say is if there's any resources, etc., that Rich has mentioned throughout the course of the webinar, then please list these in the question box as well, and I can follow up with Rich and get a bit more information to go out with the follow-up email. So the next question's from Lindsay Stother from Stirling Council. Thanks for the presentation. Can you advise how long the pilot was run for?
Yes, okay, so the pilot is still going at the moment. It took, to be fair, it took about a year to sort of plan and get particularly early senior management engagement, and then into the kind of the sort of logistical side of running a couple of workshops and sort of building from there. So the upfront buy-in, I think, was key. The use of a champion, and finding a champion who was appropriate for all the reasons I said earlier, a kind of credibility level and stuff. That there was an awful lot of that upfront to do, and then the time to sort of work with making sure we've got the right people at the workshops to sort of map the system out. But then also, I haven't majored on it, but on the kind of technical side, we've developed, as I say, a performance suite of measures. We've got 6 sort of key measures to sort of provide a summary of the system to allow our senior managers to manage it. That was an awful lot of work developing that. Some, as I mentioned, some measures we were able to turn off. Some we needed to start collecting. So we had sort of 6 months or so, I think it's probably fair to say, working with our technical people in IT, for example, making sure that the IT systems could provide that information. So about a year so far. I think what we're planning to do is to sort of test this in anger, so to speak, at one of our quarterly reviews after Christmas. So we'll have a sort of product that's ready to use, and the idea is that how we've presented the information will be sort of driving the behaviours at the review meeting. So hopefully we'll be looking across piece, across teams, and looking at things like leading and lagging measures. So what upstream measures have we got that gives us an early indication that we may be off track on something. So very much a sort of change of focus. But yeah, we're not in a position where we can evaluate the pilot yet. We're very much still in it. If that helps answer that question.
That's Rich. Next question, Stefan Tashner. In retrospect, what would you have done differently, knowing what you know now?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think the biggest challenges we've had have certainly been around the sort of cultural side, and largely I think this is my personal view. There are obviously other people in the team who would have their views, but we did have a few conversations around the sort of current belief systems which were in the organisation. So particularly the two we were looking to try and break, the sort of self-reinforcing. Most people kind of accept on logic that understanding a system is a good thing because it's looking across the teams. The things which we would do differently is we didn't really account, I guess, for how much people trusted the current measures. I think that's probably fair to say. I think, I can hold my hand up and say, honestly, we probably didn't give them enough time to adjust to the sort of new measures as we're introducing things through, because obviously people get wind of new change and things that you're doing, even if it's on top of the current way you're working. The two sort of belief systems we had was that, the kind of more data we collected, so the more detailed measures we had and the more frequently they were reported, this sort of illusion of control, it's a well-documented heuristic in psychology, somehow the more you collect, the more control you have. Now, we've got lots of studies, obviously, that show that's not the case, and it's measuring the right things at the right frequency, but as a sort of ingrained belief system in pockets of the environment agency, I think it's fair to say I think it was probably unfair to, we wouldn't want people to feel like we were sort of pulling the rug out from underneath the current system. So giving them more time and spending a bit more time engaging with them, explaining the benefits of this system, but also perhaps running something more in parallel so that, we can give them time to adjust and have that trust, really, because it is about trust in the new system. Some of these ways of working that we've had have been in the agency for a long time. And it's understandable that people take comfort in that, really. So that's the sort of first belief system. The more we measure, the more we control. The second I've alluded to in the presentation, which is around, this sort of mindset that measurement alone leads to sustained improvement. Sometimes it does, but again, most of the studies out there are showing that if you want, the key word there, I think, is sustained improvement. You have to look across systems and involve people working in the different teams to actually change the way you're working. There's lots and lots of examples that I'm sure we can all cite of where we've had badly set targets that have driven the wrong behaviour across all sectors of the public sector, really, and all sort of parts of government service. So, yeah, I think what we were looking at there is giving people a chance to run in tandem the old system and the new system, really, and then gradually we can turn, we can turn those old measures off. Kind of knowing that they're not adding value, I guess, from a statistical perspective is very different, and making sure that people are happy for them to be, kind of turned off, if you like. So, yeah, it's very much making sure that we're spending enough time with some of these pockets of people, and that we don't just sort of pull the rug out underneath them and say, right, well, you now have to manage this way. So yeah, hopefully that's answered that question.
Thanks, Rich. I'm just going to give you back control of the screen because there's a couple of questions related to your slides in here. Next question's Alex Lewis. How did you persuade cynical colleagues to see the value of a systems approach? Yeah,
that's a really interesting one. I think for for some, which again it's kind of down to broad character types, really. There are people who will be persuaded by logic alone. So you can cite case studies, external case studies of where this has worked. Having senior level buy-ins so they can start to have the right conversations, speak the same language in meetings, I think helps as well. I mentioned earlier cost-benefit analysis. That's going to add a lot of weight once we've got this pilot underway, and hopefully it will build momentum for the other 5 that I mentioned, particularly people that are working at a more strategic level. If we can pick a future pilot that proves that this works, you know, kind of at a helicopter level and a grassroots level. But also the other sort of angle is, as I mentioned, is the extrinsic motivators. So, sometimes, you know, doing the right thing because it's logical, understandably for some characters it isn't enough. So in a way, having those external factors, so I mentioned the ISO standards that are changing, which I think is great. It's a good thing, and the National Audit Office report, you know, that does create that kind of imperative for change, because as much as, you know, that there will be people out there, which I've spoken to, have bought into this stuff and they absolutely agree with it. They're happy with it, but they're saying their day job is just kind of so busy they don't have time to try and run some of these things in parallel, because obviously that does require time. Sometimes having that imperative that, you know, actually we have to change if we want to maintain our ISO accreditation, and the National Audit Office are kind of telling us we need to do it. You know, that will just get done, which isn't necessarily the best way of enforcing change, but it does cover, I think, at least most of those. You know, what's the kind of basis that you'll shift people's beliefs and attitudes and therefore behaviour, so you can apply to the sort of logic alone, or as I say, some of the external things as well. So sometimes doing the right thing, even if there's evidence for it, isn't enough because people don't physically have the capacity. And I think it's fair to say in the Environment Agency it's the same as lots of other places. I alluded to it earlier. Sometimes, you know, the way we're working, there's kind of so much waste and red tape tied up with how we're working, and we're running so fast on that treadmill of our day jobs, we don't have time to step off to actually look at how we're working. I think that's a key thing we have to sort of break, really. I think that's sort of fair to say there. So hopefully that's answered that one.
Thanks, Rich. Next question's from David Brown at Dundee City Council. In your input process output model, where do you measure the outcome?
Where do you measure the outcomes? Yeah, very, very good question again. So that's the reason why we picked the permitting system. So there's two options under this model, and again, there are different models you can use. We chose the system map approach. You can look at kind of environmental outcomes or society outcomes, so very much the kind of outcomes that would be under like an EFQM model. That's a sort of standard that they can be measured as proxy measures from the output measures. That makes sense. So what we've decided to do is look at outcome measures completely separately from this work. So we've made it very clear that the remit for this work is looking at, you know, for example, we're measuring a permit that's delivered on time to quality. So that's very much an output measure. Sometimes it is semantics a little bit around, you know, the sort of language between the two. But for us, we've made it very clear what the definition was. This work is aiming to improve quality and timeliness of our permits. The next question, which is a permit the correct way of delivering best value for the environment? That's a whole other stream of work which is covered in the overall programme, but it hasn't been attempted in this area of work, really. So we have behavioural economists and people like that are working on those. So, you know, is permitting the best way to manage this particular site? At the moment, we have a government statute to deliver these permits, so we're making sure we're doing them in the most efficient and effective way as possible. That's the aim of this project, if you like, to make sure we're spending government money as well as we can. And then there's another area that's looking at outcomes. So, I mean, that's kind of related, I guess, a little bit to this, although that lies in another part of our organisation and under the performance management banner, if you like. So we have a clear kind of strategy map with a clear line of sight between, you know, what are the top environmental outcomes that we need to achieve over the next 5 years or even 20 years in our long-term strategy. So things like river water quality, air quality in cities, all of those types of things. We have a suite of measures that are set up that ensure that we're hitting some of those outcomes. But it's very difficult, and I'm sure local authorities will be able to empathise with this, that sometimes we're only a contributor to an outcome, and then we get into a kind of philosophical debate about, well, how much do we measure just the part we can control or our level of influence onto something else? So, yeah, that's quite a big area of discussion which we're ongoing, trying to improve the way we measure that. And as I say, my colleagues in our performance management department are doing a great job for that. What we're trying to do with this is trying to improve the way our business operates as efficiently as possible. So yeah, I guess the short answer is we're focusing on outputs with this work, but we will be linking into outcomes with other streams of work, if that makes sense.
Right, so it's next question, Marjorie Dawn. What would you advise on how to measure team KPIs while taking into account interdependencies, in particular in terms of efficiency projects?
Yeah, and that's an interesting one. Again, that's probably an area which we can certainly get better at. Using something like the system map does identify the gaps between teams. So, for example, there were a few stages in our permitting process in terms of a flow chart, if you can imagine it that way, which just weren't measured. So we weren't sure sort of how long things were sitting in certain parts. So in terms of efficiency, you've obviously got to start end to end. So the system map gives you a view end to end, and then from that you can work backwards, as I say. So you work out what your customers want and are they happy. So you measure customer survey, your qualitative sort of data. You then look at your outputs and say, okay, are they delivered to the quality criteria? Because you'll have quality criteria, and then are they delivered efficiently? So I think that was part of the question it mentioned about efficiency programs. And then a lot of the efficiency is tied up in the process box. So if the sort of middle box that I was showing on the screen, I'll just pop back to the slide. So this one here, this is where a lot of the efficiency comes in. This is where the sort of cycle times coming in. How often are things like permits, for example, going back a few steps because they're not right? You know, that if we can reduce the number of defects coming in at the front end, that's where we can get those efficiency savings. So yeah, I guess it's back to some of the very simple principles from Lean Six Sigma. If you take the lean approach, you know, which is about stripping out waste, how many steps can we take out? So the approval stages that I mentioned, you know, we're looking at taking a couple of those out. That means people then are only doing work which directly is valued by the customer. And then if you look at the Six Sigma side, which again you can improve quality and reduce timeliness by cutting out defects. So very much what we've tried to do is take the purest view that, you know, quality assurance at a sort of purest level is something which shouldn't be needed in a process. What you do is try and mistake-proof that process and not let the rejects come in the first place. So by measuring things like the input level, which I mentioned earlier, you know, even things as simple as what are the common mistakes on the forms that our customers are making, you know, and is it something that we can change around the form design? That's an area we're going to be looking at. We've done some sort of basic, what we call a Pareto analysis, so a quick count of where the common mistakes are. Is it certain forms that are causing more problems than others? If we can, because we'll never be able to stamp out any errors at all, of course, that's a sort of utopia. But certainly for efficiency across teams, if we can improve those reject rates and get them as low as possible at the front end before they come in, and we cut out, as I say, extra steps that our staff are making that perhaps aren't adding value, that will increase quality and reduce timeliness. So there's your efficiency count there, can be measured on 2 dimensions. That's certainly the sort of the approach we're trying to take with this.
Thanks, Rich. We've still got about 9 or 10 questions in actually, so we'll try to get through as many as possible in the next 10 minutes. The next question, Joanna Dowling, you mentioned having a core change team of 10 but an additional 300 or so trained in some kind of improvement. Can you please elaborate on what improvement training your 300 staff received and how you have deployed these new skills?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So, and again, I think we've learned over the years, and we've had some challenges around how active can we make the network. So we keep a database of the level of training that each of our staff has and how much kind of capacity they have and what business knowledge they have. So the idea being, if obviously as a central team we have a strategy and we have prioritized work programs and projects that we have to deliver. Outside of that, we try and maintain a bit of a proactive capacity, so, you know, to deal with queries and things like that. But what we're trying to do is very much change our model, moving from a kind of specialist role to what we would call a trusted advisor role. So we're trying to advise and enable the business to make those improvements for themselves, and us be a kind of enabler and a change agent as opposed to sort of doing all the work, because the journey we've been on. We're starting every time we run one of these projects. Of course, we're not only hopefully helping those that are doing the job, but we're also giving them techniques on how to do this themselves. One of the sort of programs that we run, just to give you a rough flavour, we run a creativity and innovation program. So that looks at kind of
So Rich, sorry everyone, we seem to be having a couple of technical issues just towards the end here. I'll just see if I can get Rich back on the line. Hi Rich.
Hi, apologies for that. The technology failed us. I wasn't dodging the question. So apologies for that. So I think, yeah, just to finish off briefly on that question. So we have the sort of creativity course, which is looking at enabling staff to sort of create the right culture and lots of different tools to improve. But we've also followed a kind of standard triangle, if you like, approach to continuous improvement. So we do sort of, if you're familiar with the coloured belts, we do a foundation level awareness program, we do a practitioner level, and then an expert coach level. So the model we're using at the moment is we train local champions who then do a project. There's the option of doing external qualifications if they want to, and then what we do as a central team is we coach and get people confident in that. So the idea is that we build up a critical mass of people that are kind of working. But as I say, it's a mixture. There's some cultural sort of training programs that we do. I mentioned the creativity and innovation program. There's some very practical programs that look at things like workshop tools, data analysis, stuff like that. So we're trying to build up this core of expertise really, so that we can call on the volunteers. If I'm honest, we probably don't make as much use of them as we can, and that's where we're trying to sort of refresh this network and make sure that, you know, where people have said they're free to help, you know, that we're through this database which we're piloting at the moment, that we're able to connect people with where the need is, because it releases some of our time to spend on more strategic stuff and more coaching and more longer term, you know, but B, it connects people with other parts of the business who may not have worked together, and then you get your kind of idea sharing and best practice, so it becomes a bit of a self-sustaining model. That's the idea. Again, if I'm honest, we need to test that through, and that's certainly one of the areas which we all agree we need to get better at. You know, we only have finite resources, so it's how best to deploy them really. So yeah, very much a sort of traditional sort of pyramid of the training program. So with a sort of foundation level practitioner and then an expert.
So the next question is Craig McIntyre from Renfrewshire Council. You mentioned rolling this approach out to other bodies. How would you go about benchmarking with others?
Yeah, again, we have various different forums, so kind of at an informal level, we share good practice across things like Warwick Business School and the performance management forums that are around there. So I think one of the speakers you had fairly recently, Pietro Micheli, I've done a lot of work with him to be able to connect in with people that are doing similar work. So things like strategy mapping, line of sight, key performance indicators, stuff like that. We've done a lot of work with them. I think where we can do kind of meaningful benchmarking, so within the Environment Agency, this is certainly an area that I'm very passionate about trying to grow, which is around, you know, use of statistically valid, meaningful comparisons. So again, we're trying to drive our culture away from arbitrary league tables and looking at things where we can actually compare using kind of, you know, statistics which are robust, looking at comparing average times to produce something where we've got a national service, and then looking at, you know, looking at the statistics saying, yeah, well, there's 2 or 3 teams here which are significantly perhaps quicker at getting a permit out. Once we've ruled out factors like demand and levels of resource and stuff. That then gives us an area to work on. It's not about saying the other teams aren't as good. They may have less resources or different geographical challenges, but it's data driven and it's robust analysis rather than just getting everybody in a room and kind of the person that shouts the loudest is the model we go with. So we're very much trying to get more rigorous with our benchmarking. I mean, there's a lot more detail underneath that in terms of the different specific techniques we're using in statistics. I'm happy to have a conversation outside of this call about that, but yeah, that might be a little bit excessive detail for a lot of people on the line. But yeah, happy to have a follow-up email or conversation about the actual types of statistics we're using. So there's informal sharing in networks, and then internally trying to do real data-driven benchmarking, as I say, rather than sort of arbitrary league tables and stuff like that.
Okay, so we've probably got time for one more question. The questions that haven't been answered I've taken a note of, and I will follow up after the webinar and send them on to Rich. So just the next question on the list is Mike Patterson from Aberdeenshire Council. How did you approach challenging meaningless targets? Did you find some staff like to own their targets? So there's two questions in there.
Yeah. Again, we've several different approaches for that. Again, if I'm honest, a lot of the challenges at the higher level targets. So we have, I mentioned national government targets for things that they will need to be challenged, kind of at the appropriate level, at the strategic level, with this pilot going forward. So having our directors and chief executives on board with this and showing, for example, that one of the targets isn't measuring the entire customer journey. We've already started to have conversations with the people that are involved in setting those targets in Whitehall and etc. So we are opening dialogue, very much so to sort of challenge those at that level. At a lower level in the organisation, we run sort of workshops and exercises on I mentioned our team leader sort of development training. So we'll run a very simple exercise where we say, can you think of examples of where you've had targets, internal targets, which we set ourselves that are driving the wrong behaviour. And as you know, if you do these things enough, we have sort of monthly training courses. There's a list of the kind of key culprits, if you like, that consistently come back. So, for example, having a target for something like, I don't know, closing a certain number of sites per quarter or whatever, we all know the intention of that is good, but what can happen is it can lead to an under-reporting issue where people are then afraid to, if they find a new site, which we actually need to know about, we need it to be on the books, they can be discouraged from reporting that because closing 10 sites this quarter has suddenly gone to closing 11. So we are aware of those sort of things, and we're working through them at the sort of grassroots level with managers. Each year we refresh our performance measures and we go out to the key leagues and test some of these sort of things and input the behaviour. But again, it's an area which I think any organisation we could always do better, trying to challenge those. So it's very much a sort of a logic approach, really. Get the right people involved who can influence them. Let's change our internal ones the way we can. If they're external targets, I think we're fortunate that a lot of local authorities, unless it's changed from several years ago when I was working in that area, we can set a lot of our own internal measures. We're not sort of held as much to government target. We have our overall high-level targets for money and people, but we have a process where we agree our targets for improvement in the environment. As I know from a local authority perspective, very often a lot of those measures are prescribed. They certainly were when I was in the police force. So yeah, it's opening the dialogue with the people you need to, and just testing stuff, really. What I want to do in the future is to test areas, systematically test different parts and different teams in our business where we have targets. So I'd love to run an experiment where we have 3 teams or 3 groups of teams, several teams in, to get a big enough sample size, and run, like Team A runs with a target and a measure, Team B runs with just a measure, Team C runs with nothing at all, and see if there's any statistically valid differences between them. Then we can start to eliminate those targets that aren't adding value, on a sort of logical level, if that makes sense. Again, I'm happy to have a conversation afterwards. I'm very passionate about this, and there's a lot more detail behind that, so hopefully that gives you a bit of a sort of answer.
Thank you, Rich. That's us got to 11:02, so I'm going to draw this webinar to a close. I'd like to extend a massive thanks to Rich on behalf of everybody who attended for taking the time to present today, and given the level of questions, it's clear that it's a topic which is certainly of interest to everyone. As I mentioned, that we will I've taken a note of all the questions which are unanswered, and we'll circulate these along with the recording and the slides in the next couple of days once we get them back from Rich. And I also encourage you, if you're interested, to join the webinar at 3 o'clock this afternoon. Joining details can either be found from the Change Managers Network Knowledge Hub page or from emailing myself directly. The final thing as well, there'll be a short survey that just follows this webinar as soon as you click out of it, so if you could complete that and let us know what you thought, and also any ideas for improvement going forward, it would be greatly appreciated. So once again, thanks to Rich, and I hope you have all enjoyed the session. Thank you.